Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. It's nice to have the opportunity to gather together today with all of you. And I would like to start out by making a small land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that Brandon University has campuses on both Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories. And these territories are the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people, including the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Cree, Dene, and Red River Métis people. Teaching, learning, and research at Brandon University are possible because of the treaties and the continued contributions of Indigenous people to this place. In acknowledging the treaties and the many Indigenous people that share this territory with Brandon University, we respect the teachings of these lands and their influence on the health and the environment and the people who inhabit this place. In relation to this presentation, I also would like to acknowledge the continued violence against Indigenous people, and that any discussion of violence must consider how violence is nested within larger processes such as colonialism. So there's a long list of authors and people to acknowledge in this presentation, and I would like to start by particularly thanking the PI of this project, Rachel Herron, for her leadership and her vision, as well as her insightful and compassionate support. Thank you to the whole team, the co-Is who have brought their invaluable expertise, as well as all the RAs, past and present, who have contributed to data collection, to transcription, analysis, and interpretation. And thank you to all our participants for their deep contributions and their continued interest in the research. Thank you to our engaged knowledge user team for all of the contributions they've made to design and ensuring that we keep in the forefront the dignity of older adults and those living with dementia. Thank you to our funders who have helped and continue to help to make this project possible. And for further information on this project, you can visit our website at www.safeplacesproject.com. I would like to pull everybody's attention briefly to the fact that we do have a content warning for this presentation because it does include descriptions of verbal, physical, and sexual violence towards staff working in long-term residential care settings. And these descriptions may be distressing or unsettling for some listeners. And due to the extreme graphic nature of the violence found in this study, we actually purposely left out a lot of the material that is going to be published in a future paper. And the fact that we felt compelled to select only certain quotes to share in a public forum does reflect the nature of violence discussed in this study. Importantly, we also recognize that listeners may have their own experiences of violence, and it's possible that you may find the content triggering. And I would like everybody to know that you can step away if you need to. So why look into violence and gender in long-term residential care, or LTRC? The adverse effects of violence in LTRC on residents and staff are well documented, and at least 90% of the nurses and other LTRC staff identify as women, and many are racialized. Violence is often framed as unavoidable or expected, and staff are often held responsible for incidents. Many staff, additionally, also feel ignored and unheard. So when we're thinking about gender itself, It's constructed and it's engaged with inside shifting historical, cultural, and social structures, relations, and practices. And these move along multiple scales. So, for instance, division of labor or organizational institutional practices and interpersonal relationships. And these perpetuate dominant patterns, practices, and bodily performances of, say, masculinity and femininity. And as such, it's been argued that LTRC is organized and structured as a gender regime, which naturalizes and devalues the work and skill involved in caring, while simultaneously expecting women to feel drawn to, committed, and responsible for an increasing share of this care work. And despite this, few studies have actually explicitly focused on how staff see and understand gender in their descriptions of violent situations, and how these interpretations are shaped by history as well as by context. And despite evidence that violence in long-term care is actually primarily directed at women, and that male residents are more likely to act violently, gender has received limited attention in research and policy on violence in LTRC, as well as in dementia care more broadly. And the current lack of attention to gender-based violence in LTRC, it results in violence prevention policies overlooking the gendered relations that shape violent interactions and their interpretation. These relations include societal and Western cultural norms that reinforce gendered practices around sexual violence in LTRC, which emphasize women's obligation to empathize with others and to put care first, even in contexts of harassment and violence. So when we talk about violence, what do we mean? So in terms of LTRC, there are many different terms to describe violent situations. These include abuse, responsive behaviors, resident-to-resident aggression, and workplace violence. And each of these terms, what they generally do is they refer to verbal, relational, and sexual acts that cause harm. And although violence may be the result of certain relationships or situations, it is influenced by a broad range of forces that impact victims' experiences and responses to violence across different spaces. For this project, our definition of violence, it emphasizes the importance of context and processes in understanding experiences, interpretations, and responses and adaptations to violence. So in this study, what we've asked is what gendered framings and responses to violence emerge in staff narratives about violent situations in LTRC. This presentation is part of a nationally funded 4-year multi-jurisdictional team-based comparative case study of violence in long-term care residential settings in 2 Canadian provinces, both Manitoba and Nova Scotia, done in collaboration with a knowledge user team. And data collection for this study was multi-method. It included document analysis, provincial surveys, interviews, and observations in long-term residential. And this presentation focuses on data collected using telephone and web-based semi-structured interviews with 29 LTRC staff in both Manitoba and Nova Scotia. So, given the sensitive nature of asking people to recall violent incidents, we designed our interview guide to enable participants to choose what they wish to disclose. And the interview guide did not include a direct question about how gender influenced violent situations. Instead, gendered descriptions of violent interactions emerged in participants' narratives of violence. The interview transcripts were analyzed inductively. We looked at how gender emerged and or how it was embedded in participants' descriptions of violent situations. And to better understand the gendered dimensions of these interactions, researchers also prompted participants to elaborate on gendered descriptions. So, for instance, we asked questions like, can you tell me more about that? Or what was that like for you? On average, our interviews lasted approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I'll give everybody just a second to have a look at this slide. Our interview participants were recruited through provincial surveys. And so the majority, that is 90% of survey participants were women. And that's really quite reflective of the gendered workforce. And survey respondents reported the frequency of the different types of violence they experienced in LTRC. So in the provincial surveys that we conducted, 103 participants were from Manitoba and 154 were from Nova Scotia. And when calculated among all survey participants, who were, again, predominantly women, the percentages were as follows. Annual rates of psychological violence, 97.4%. Annual rates of physical violence, 88.1%. Annual rates of sexual violence, 68.7%. Annual rates of violence overall, 98.5%. Survey respondents were asked if they wished to participate in an interview where they described these violent situations. 29 interviews with staff members were then conducted. And consistent with current statistics in LTRC, 90% of participants identified as women. And the majority, 55%, were registered or psychiatric nurses because of the ability to recruit through colleges as well as surveys. And consistent with this population, many of the participants were older women. 40% of the participants were aged 36 to 49 years of age, and 45% were aged 50 and older. And the majority of participants, 72%, were white. 31% worked between 30 to 39 hours a week, and 28% worked 40 or more hours a week. The findings of this presentation seek understandings of the gendered interpretations and strategies employed in response to violence in LTRC, and they raise questions about the consequences of such for both residents and staff. And we found that participants' narratives highlighted the importance of body size, strength, speed, and perceptions of capability in anticipating who might perpetrate violence and also what form that violence might take. So gender and bodily characteristics also influenced work roles and who was assigned or expected to provide backup in the event of violent situations. We discovered that staff observed that past experiences of gender-based violence and gendered power dynamics outside of LTRC shaped violent situations and power dynamics inside of LTRC. And in response to these violent situations, it emerged that staff often minimized, downplayed, and laughed off violence to cope with working through violent situations, revealing the power of their gendered duty to care. Participants' narratives contained gendered language that highlighted the importance of physical characteristics and perceptions of strength and capability in interpreting and responding to violence. Women working in LTRC often identified strong, tall, able-bodied, faster male residents in LTRC as threatening, while also viewing the men they worked with as an essential reinforcement or protectors in the event that a violent situation occurred. So one example that you can see in the slide before you is from a female nurse in her 30s. And she's describing a situation here where a male resident became angry. He got really mad one day because he wanted her to give him a goatee, and he had this massive beard, and she was like, I don't know how to do that. And he was so mad, and he was physically coming close to me, and he's big and physically quite able. And I was kind of backed into the corner, and I remember being like, and she calls the name of the staff, and that was the one male staff that we had. And he got to the point where he just physically put himself between me and this patient. Left out of the above example were derogatory and racial slurs that were leveled at the staff member by the resident. Notably, this unsettling situation began with the demand to provide a service. And when the staff member did not acquiesce to this demand, the resident began insulting and cornering her. And the response to this physical threat was to call for help from the only male staff, who then used his body to physically block the resident. In descriptions of violent situations, men frequently emerged as either the perpetrators of physical violence or as the protectors from violence in LTRC. In the example that you see in this slide, a nurse who described herself to us as old and having gray hair discusses a situation where a male resident cornered her, and she then had to call for help. I was left there alone. The healthcare aide went and ran and hid in a room, and I was there alone. So I went behind the desk, which had a little lock on it, and he followed me, and he's waving the cane in the air and threatening to hit me again. And I called the other floor, and a healthcare aide came, and it was a great big muscly healthcare aide. And when he saw this big, tall, like 6'6" guy kind of hovering over him, he stopped. The nurse was relieved at the size and the strength of the healthcare aide who responded and stopped the resident from being aggressive. And in this interview, she went on to suggest that there are not enough security staff to perform the gendered role of protecting frontline staff and their safe spaces, in this instance behind the desk, in the facility. In contrast, one experienced female healthcare aide we interviewed described herself as being expected to fulfill gendered protector roles because of both of her size as well as her strength. At different institutional levels, for instance, protocols and management practices, gender, size, and strength were read as threats and as a source of power to be managed in the case of residents or used to control in the case of staff. And body size and stature were found to matter in the context of perceptions of violence. So specifically, men living in LTRC were perceived as a greater physical threat when they were described by participants as tall, strong, fast, young, and able, while women were more often viewed as less of a threat and described to us as little, frail, weak, and vulnerable. Participants further suggested that threats or problems posed by women living in LTRC were different and at times framed women as more manipulative or socially disruptive, saying things to us, for instance, like, She loves to have drama. Staff narratives and language can also reveal gendered duties to care on multiple levels. So one female nurse manager explained to us that in the context of a code white, which is an alert to workers for immediate assistance with a violent situation, larger male staff may be asked to manage the resident. She said to us, if it's a larger person, we may get some of our larger male staff to come and help us. We've had the occasion where we've had to, I guess, use a little bit of force with, sitting a larger person down, or because a lot of times we end up giving an IM of Haldol or some antipsychotic because there's no other way we can get any medication into this person. While there were a few men working in LTRC involved in this study, some men found the role of being perceived as protectors or as backup with so-called violent residents rewarding. And this illustrated a cultural capital associated with this duty. So, for example, one male healthcare aide we interviewed, who was a healthcare aide of 15 years, described his role to us by saying, I think I get thrown into it more. You kind of like, oh, you're the man, so you can go deal with so-and-so. So you're more like kind of, I guess, that spokesman, or you have that main role, I guess, in that violence prevention thing where you're directing traffic. I think, just because they look at me as tough, more tough, stronger. The aide described his role to us as one of leadership, power, and control, using terms like spokesman, directing traffic, and tough. On the other hand, the one woman that we interviewed who was perceived as physically stronger by her coworkers stated that she was expected to perform and fulfill gendered protector roles because of her size and strength. And she stated that this exposed her to a greater risk of hurting herself or hurting residents. And what this reveals to us is an uneven gendered nature of care work, risks, and rewards. In some cases, staff made broad generalizations about the forms of violence they expected or anticipated from men and women living in LTRC. In general, many staff were primed to expect physical violence from men, and they looked for physical cues and markers to anticipate violence. For example, as one nurse in her 20s explained to us, I've noticed that male residents are more physically reactive than more of the female ones. So far have been more verbally reactive. So it's easier to work my way around that because the male ones are usually the ones that act out. This participant generally anticipated different forms of violence from men and women in the facility in which she worked, and stated that she found it easier to manage verbal or psychological violence from women versus physical violence from men. Furthermore, one participant, a nurse of over 2 decades, indicated to us that part of her role in preventing violence was to anticipate or to be suspicious of potential perpetrators. Some staff mentioned past experiences of gendered violence as a trigger for residents acting violently during personal care, while staff also reflected on the impact of intimate partner violence on their responses to residents. Staff also shared that past experiences of their own intimate partner violence shaped their responses to violence at work. So, for instance, one female healthcare aide in her early 30s explained her response to an incident by saying, "My ex is emotionally abusive, and I've been working through that. And there was one resident who was in pain, and he was lashing out by being rude. Just swearing, yelling, just rambling angrily, that drunken rambling, And it triggered something in me personally that's left me very unsettled. and I actually had to step away, but it triggered me and it hit me quite hard. While this staff member acknowledged that the resident was lashing out due to pain he was experiencing, she also stated she found it just a little too much for her because of her past experiences of violence with her ex. In another example, a continuing care assistant in her late 40s stated that because of her past experiences of intimate partner violence, she covered up her arms with a sweater or a jacket to hide bruising from residents hitting her. She stated that it's not, quote unquote, something I like to talk about, and that she did not, quote unquote, like to let people see stuff like that, because she didn't want others to think the bruising was coming from her husband. Additionally, some staff explained that residents sometimes adhered to gendered power dynamics from earlier periods in their lives, respecting male authority or listening to men working in LTRC better than women. In contrast, multiple staff explained that men working in LTRC triggered residents with past experiences of gender-based violence. As past experiences of violence have been shown to have resonance with current experiences, for instance, covering up as a strategy for managing violence or maintaining control, these narratives speak to the continued influence of instances of both intimate partner violence as well as social and cultural histories of gender outside of LTRC regarding staff responses to violence in their care work. Consistent with other forms of gender-based violence, common responses and strategies to violence in LTRC are minimizing or normalizing violence in order to navigate, maintain, or advance through a perceived threat. So, for example, a continuing care assistant in her late 40s stated to us, "We've had men that have been a little sexual, and most of that, we just shake it off, get out of here like that. That doesn't work anymore. A lot of times, or you just say, you know what, I'll get my husband after you." And a lot of times they just start laughing or whatever. So you try not to let it bother you. I mean, it does. But I just kind of chalk it up to, it's just men. It's just men. Men being men. There's an assumption arising here in the form of an expectation, men being men, that men will always simply perpetrate unwanted sexual behavior, and women are then just expected to find ways of, quote unquote, dealing with it, no matter the personal or professional consequences. Similar to this example, many staff drew on gender roles and relations and humor, laughter, or joking to redirect residents and or set boundaries in a caring rather than a punitive manner. In doing so, they minimize the impact of sexual violence, at least in front of residents, while also acknowledging in their interviews that it does, quote unquote, bother them. While staff highlighted their duty to care and the right to preserve the dignity of residents regarding sexual desire, they also discussed the sometimes problematic nature of how to set boundaries. When care supersedes the ability to say no to violent behaviors. In another example, one nurse in her late 40s described an incident wherein a male resident would masturbate in front of staff, as well as verbally and sexually harass them. When confronted, this resident would say he did not, swear word, care. This nurse explained that while she could ignore the behavior, she still had a duty to provide and maintain care despite her own need for boundaries and for safety. Some of the limitations of the study are that we had few racialized, unregulated workers in our sample. Few men working in LTRC in our sample, but this is also consistent with the gendered nature of the field. Gender was also not asked about directly in this study, but because of this, we may have found fewer quote unquote negative cases where staff believe that gender has little to do with violence. The strength of this approach is that we were able to explore the ways gender is embedded in understandings and descriptions of violence. Additionally, the voices and perspectives of older adults in care are missing from this analysis. So in conclusion, gender plays an important role in how staff prevent, respond to, and experience violent situations in LTRC. At different institutional levels, for instance, protocols and management practices, gender, size, and strength were read as threats and a source of power to be managed in the case of residents, or used to control in the case of staff. Care workers' histories, positions, practices, moves, and strategies are habituated by gender regimes both inside and outside of LTRC. The language staff used in their interviews to describe violent situations and forms of violence revealed gendered perceptions of perpetrators, protectors, and threats of violence. Staff narratives described individual strategies inside of LTRC that mirror strategies and responses to violence and power dynamics outside of LTRC. This included normalizing some violence. For instance, as seen in the earlier example of describing sexual violence as quote unquote men being men. Downplaying, minimizing, and empathizing are seen as part of the job and part of the duty to care. So, for instance, part and parcel of the job. Because residents cannot, quote unquote, help themselves, which is linked to broader pathologizing narratives that residents are not of sound mind due to disease. Staff cannot say no to caring for people who perpetrate violence because of their duty to provide care. The gendered interpretations and strategies employed in response to violence in LTRC raises questions about the vulnerability of the bodies of both residents and staff, and as well as consequences for both. This perhaps suggests the importance of institutional restructuring, further pushing skills-based interventions that focus just on individuals and not on systems with the promise to ease or ameliorate violence perpetuated against female workers with quote unquote the right tools and resources, places a personal responsibility on them, ensuring that women are then blamed for their quote unquote failure to protect themselves and their vulnerable bodies in spaces that are already fraught. This also possibly suggests the necessity of including trauma-informed approaches to resident care, to staff support, and violence prevention, as well as further discussions around gender dynamics. So that concludes this part of the presentation, and I'll be taking questions now if anybody has anything that they would like to ask. Thank you so much for listening.